it has been said that art is the revelation of private truth in a public place. And certainly one of the most private and compelling art forms is the written word. Tonight we're speaking with first-time author Robin Silverman about her new book, Lemon Reef. I apologize, my brain went totally out for a second. Welcome.
Thank you.
Now, this book, when I was reading the description of it and thumbing through it, seems to have many, many different components. It's about young love, it's about domestic violence, it's about loss. How did the idea for the book come to you, and what is the synopsis of the book?
The idea came to me. The idea came to me early on in my own. It stems from my own youth, and it's about it's a love story between two adolescent girls. It's told retrospectively in the context of a present-day mystery about one of their deaths.
Now, you you have been trained in the law. You've worked in domestic violence for many years. You're a psychologist. Did all of that life experience come to bear in writing this book?
Yes. I drew from experiences of my own. I drew from experiences of people I know. I drew from experiences from work. Sure.
Tell us a little bit about how the plot begins. I know it starts, in retrospect, there is a death that takes place in the waters off the coast of Florida, and I don't want to give away the whole plot, but tell us about the incident that sets this story in motion.
The incident that sets the story in motion is that one of the girls dies, and they're adults now. It's been 10 years since they've seen each other. The other hears about it. She's relocated. She hears about the death, and it brings back for her this experience from her childhood, a very intense love relationship, and all of the loss associated with that. And she goes home for the funeral.
And how long was the relationship between the two young women, with the one that really clearly lasted for many years, past their adolescence into adulthood?
Well, the actual relationship was a year, a little over a year, and it's between their 14th and 15th years. Very formative time, and they, you know, I think early love relationships are very formative. They had the added experience of having been exposed to violence, despair, alienation from early on, and their relationship was the thing that that helped them. Really, the only thing in the course of their childhoods and in one of the characters' whole life that made a difference for them.
Right. How common is that, from your experience as a psychologist, that someone at this formative age, you know, with their mid-teens, 14, 15, has an experience that becomes the formative experience of their life? I mean, is that the age in which we have experiences that mark us for the rest of our days?
Oh, I wouldn't limit it to that.
Yes, yes.
I think experiences at any age can mark us for the rest of our days. But I do think that those are tender and particularly vulnerable years, and that what happens to us at that time makes a huge difference.
Right. These two women had this experience in their early teens. Would you say, from what happens to these characters then, that these become quote-unquote only lesbian characters, or they have a diversity to their sexuality that just was started by that experience in their teens?
One of them is a lesbian. The other is not, and was not when the relationship really took place. She's predominantly heterosexual, and this is the only lesbian relationship that she has in her life. That's the character who dies. And the question, of course, is whether, from the outset, it has to do with whether her husband killed her.
And we don't want to give away, of course, the end of the book. But what do you think that her adolescent lover thinks about this? What is her take on this when she goes back to the funeral? Does she believe that indeed her teenage lover has been murdered by her husband?
She's not sure at first. And I think one of the things that's different about, let's say, for example, a death by domestic violence, it's not so much trying to figure out who did it, and the story is not really about who did it. The challenge is how to prove it. And that's really what the mystery is about. It's about how to prove that this actually happened. First to figure out whether it did, and then to prove how it did.
Right. How similar is the plot in this book, leaving aside the death off the coast of Florida and whatnot, to real life experiences you've dealt with in your practice over the last 25 years? I guess what I'm asking is, how common is domestic violence, whether we write a novel about it or not?
Oh, I think it's quite prevalent. I couldn't give you specific numbers. I do say in this story that the #1 cause of death for pregnant women in the United States is interpersonal violence.
And I remember reading somewhere once that the #1 day as far as domestic violence against women from spouses is Super Bowl Sunday.
Oh, wow.
Is that correct?
I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know.
And it just seems like somehow all the tension, all the quote-unquote machismo of that day sometimes gets acted out in violence against women. The other thing I remember reading in this same story was that over half of those instances of domestic violence aren't reported. I mean, so it's an incredibly underreported crime. It's
an underreported crime, and that's why the idea that it's the #1 cause of death for pregnant women is remarkable, because we're talking about proven murders.
You said that you drew on a lot of your experience for this book. What was the most painful part for you to pull forth and put on the pages here? I mean, how much of you do we see in this book?
That's hard to say. The main character is certainly based on it's told in first person, and I think it certainly is a representation of me, at least to some extent. And it's also a fiction, and I think I would say that that everything is to some extent affected by who I am and what my experiences have been.
Right.
But it's also fictionalized.
Right. Now, you said it took you several years to write the book, that it was churning around in your head for a while before you put it on the page. Do you remember that moment when the incident that became the nucleus of the story hit you? I mean, was it the end of the story? Was it the beginning of the story? Was it a character study that you said, oh, I've got a book?
I think it was in a conversation with my kid, who's here, and figuring out how she dies. That sort of helped me envision the rest of it.
Right. So it didn't get written right at the beginning. It wasn't like you wrote it chronologically. You had an idea and then you kind of went back and put it all together.
That's right.
Yeah. Now you said it's part mystery. It's all fiction. Who are the authors that have influenced you? I mean,
a great question. Dorothy Allison, without question. I reference her briefly in the story. And Bastard out of Carolina. And I don't know anybody who writes about poverty better than she does. Daniel Woodrell may be a close second, wrote Winterbone, and he's been a big influence. And in both cases, they have dynamic young characters who were just inspiring.
Right. Do you think that the whole issue of, I mean, domestic violence is difficult to write about. It's difficult to deal with. You can see when it's even reported, sometimes reporters have a hard time putting their hands around it. Writing about it must be difficult, but also something else that is written about even less is poverty. Right. In the United States. Right. I mean, it's something that almost has to come out of the closet in literature. What's been your experience of writing about that?
It's what I've cared as much about writing. I've cared as much about capturing aspects of poverty in the story as I did about disavowed same-sex relations. And the reason for that is because I believe that middle, upper middle, wealthy classes are just in blatant denial about the impact of poverty on people's lives. And in the United States, you have the added insult of blaming people for being poor.
Talk a little bit about that, because certainly within the LGBT community, it is really like coming out of the closet twice. The facts speak to the absolute truth that members of the LGBT community, when put against the greater heterosexual community, are more likely to have financial distress, more likely to live in poverty, certainly young people and adolescents. Did you come across any figures or information about that when you were writing this book?
No. I wrote about poverty from the perspective of the character who is born early into it, and whose family continues to be challenged by it.
Right. When you finished the book, who was the first person that you gave it to read?
When I finished it, I gave it to my former partner to read. I also gave it to the facilitator of my writing group, Connor Bajornby.
Right. And what was their response? I mean, anything that surprised you? I mean, what did you expect to hear besides, oh, it's wonderful and I love it? What stuck out for them? Was it the aspect of the relationship? Was it the description of poverty, the emphasis and attention given to domestic violence?
The sadness of the story, and in a way the inevitability of it. Aspects of poverty for sure, but also just how painful the girls' breakup is, and what happens to one of them. The reason why I'm hesitating in terms of the question, who did I give it to, is because there have been many endings.
Yes.
So, I've given it to many people over time at various points when I thought of it as done, and it wasn't.
Right. Are you happy with the ending now?
I am happy with the ending now.
In our last few moments, tell me what you would like readers to take away from this book, Lemon Reef.
I think I hope that they would take from it that for those who have experienced domestic violence, that it resonates with their experience, and for kids, gay kids, I hope that they would take from it that their love is valid and essential, and that they should pursue it courageously.
Great, thank you so much. We've been speaking with Robin Silverman, first-time author from Berkeley, California, about her new book, her first novel, Lemon Reef. I'm David Perry. Next up, our conversation with Bay Area actor Jesse Rivas. We'll be right back.